Well, good morning everyone. You join us after the first Labour budget since 2010, and to discuss that with me I'm joined by a very special guest, Tony Cork, one of our senior tax editors. Tony, could you give us in half a dozen bullet points or so the most important points to come out of yesterday's budget?
Yes, of course. Well, generally we got what we expected. That big headline, of course, was the changes to the employers' national insurance.
Right.
There was an increase in the rate, and also changes to the point at which national insurance kicks in. We then had an interesting announcement regarding the thresholds for personal allowances and national insurance.
Right.
There were rumours that these would be frozen for another 2 years, but they will in fact return to being increased in line with inflation from 2028. One of the next big changes we had was, again expected, was changes to the rates of capital gains tax. And there were, in addition to that, there were a tax, you might say, on business assets, and the rates at which the capital gains tax will apply to gains on those. Then we move on to pensions. A lot of rumours about this, but when it came down to it, the single change was that pensions will be brought into the scope of inheritance tax. There's a lot of complicated rules around this, which is why the change is not coming into effect until 2027. So there'll be a lot that we can cover in detail on that as time goes by. Okay. In addition to that, we had other changes to inheritance tax. These mainly relate to business assets and also to agricultural property. So again, we can go into more detail, and those changes aren't immediate either. And the last big set of changes, which were a little bit of a surprise but not entirely, were changes to the stamp duty land tax regime. And there are a considerable number of tweaks to the rates and of which they will apply.
Okay, so in summary, as far as you're concerned, no great surprises?
No great surprises, but a lot of detail.
A lot of detail. As always, the devil is in the detail. Well, thank you. We will talk about the detail shortly. So grabbing all the headlines was the increase to the rate of employers' national insurance. We've heard lots of doom-mongering about what it's going to cost small businesses in particular. Could you break that down and give us some real examples of what it might cost a typical business?
Yeah, okay, well, let's start with the detail of the changes. We have an increase of 1.2% from 13.8% to 15%.
And is that irrespective of whatever size the business?
Yes, it is, but there was some mitigating changes, or there was one mitigating change, which was the increase in the employment allowance from 5,000 per annum to 10,500. That actually is, if you like, a discount on the national insurance that employers have to pay. So if their liability is less than 10,500, they pay nothing.
Okay.
So we had that in it, but what was, on the other hand, what we had is a reduction in the point at which national insurance becomes payable by employers. That was previously, or is, 9,100, but starting next year it will become 5,000, and that makes quite a big difference to all employers. To give you some idea of figures, if we took a small employer with 5 employees, average earnings of £35,000 per annum, the cost will be neutral. The changes will have a more or less neutral effect, because the increase in national insurance will be outweighed by the increase in the employment allowance.
Okay.
Take that to a medium-sized employer, or a small medium-sized employer with 35 employees, or 30 employees earning 35,000 a year, and the cost exceeds 20,000. It's about 22,000 a year, which is an extraordinary increase.
Per employee?
No, obviously it's 20. So if you've got 30 employees,
right.
And their average pay is £35,000 a year.
Yeah.
The total cost,
the extra
will be £22,000. Okay. So for bigger employers, it just gets proportionally higher and higher.
Yeah.
So Yeah, so that's it. There are no other changes.
Are there any ways to mitigate that rise?
Yeah, there is. Not directly, but certainly employers can start to look at making salary sacrifice, particularly around pensions.
Okay.
That will help reduce the national insurance burden as employers making payments for employees do not attract national insurance liability.
Okay, thank you. So Tony, there's a lot of talk pre-budget about potentially increasing capital gains tax and whether that would impact the man on the street, so to speak, in terms of property sales or sales of other assets. Could you explain, in terms of general gains, what the changes to CGT are for rates and rules?
Yeah. Of course. Yes, so we got the increases that were expected, just the details were unknown.
Right.
So the change in rates for general gains, these are not gains on non-residential properties or business assets, just for general gains. The 10% rate, which was applicable to basic rate taxpayers, is increasing to 18, or in fact has increased to 18%, and the 20% rate, which was applicable to gains made by higher rate and additional rate taxpayers, is increased to 24%. As I said, there's no change to the rate of tax on gains for residential properties. In fact, the changes here align the tax rates for all gains, so they're now in line for residential gains and for general gains.
Okay.
As far as the annual exempt amount concerned, that's 3,000. That hasn't changed. So really, it's just a straight increase in rates.
Okay. And when do these rate increases take effect?
Well, they took effect from yesterday,
Oh, really?
Budget day. Yeah. So that's just to stop people from
avoiding,
obviously making transactions between now and say next tax year, and dumping assets and making gains at the lower tax rate. Yeah.
So in general terms, not much that your average Joe can do to mitigate capital gains tax on general gains?
No, not at all, really. I mean, there's the usual tactics, which is if you're husband and wife or in the civil partnership, you can split gains between each other. So you both make use of an annual exemption. And really, wherever possible, use your annual exemption. So that, particularly for owners of quoted shares, you can make some transactions at the end of the year to generate a gain. To use your annual exemption. In the long run, that will reduce your overall tax bill, hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've talked about general gains. What about disposal of business assets? What are the changes there to capital gains tax?
Yes, well, there were changes to rates there too. They will be retaining the £1 million lifetime allowance for the special rate of gains on business assets, but there's an increase in the rates. Now they won't or haven't increased from budget day. They will increase from starting in April 2025, and the 10% rate will become 14% for gains made on or after 6th of April 2025. And then the rate will become 18% for gains made on or after 6th of April 2026. That's right.
So there is an opportunity for some tax planning there then, if it's not taking effect till next April.
Yes, but it's limited. Really, because you've got to generate the gains, so it means selling business assets or assets that qualify for business asset taper relief is not just selling business assets. It has to be the sale of whole or part of a business. So that's not a straightforward event. You can't really plan. You not really plan around that. No, indeed. So in terms of other business assets, there is also what's known as investors relief. Now, investors relief is akin to business asset disposal relief, but it is for share owners and business asset owners that are don't take any part in the business itself. Okay. So they might be business angels, typically business angels.
Or sleeping partners, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a bit more complicated, okay. But yes, there's people that are not active in the business, right. So it's just work with that. Now that it's a relatively new relief, and I'm just checking my notes here, it was introduced about 9 years ago, and there is at the moment a limit on that of a lifetime limit of £10 million. So you can make £10 million of gains and obtain investor relief. Mm-hmm. That limit is being aligned with business asset disposal relief, so that's going to be cut to £1 million, and there's also changes to rates. Now those rates are then going to be in line with the changes for business asset disposal relief. So there will be an increase from 2025 next year from 10% to 14%. And then from 2026 there will be an increase from 14% to 18%. So and that doesn't necessarily affect an awful lot of people, but
no, but for those that it does affect, there's significant changes.
There's significant changes for business angels. Yeah. They'll have to pay more tax when they bail out of a company. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Tony. So a subject that affects all of us, that's pensions. Again, pre-budget, there was a lot of talk about potentially a raid on pension pots. What's the reality of the situation, Tony? Are we all going to be much worse off?
Well, it's good news, bad news, really. No change to the rates of relief on pension contributions, which was a big fear. Yeah. And no special charges or income tax charges on pensions. But what there is the introduction or the making pension savings subject to inheritance tax. So that means when someone dies, if they have any value in their pensions, normally that will pass on to the beneficiary, and it will be subject to income tax. Now that will cease to apply, well, presumably cease to apply, and instead inheritance tax will apply. So the issue here is it is quite complex, and there's a lot of discussion and consultation between the revenue going on, so much so that the changes won't be applicable until April 2027.
Okay. Well, you talked about value in the pension. Would you have a figure in mind, or?
No, it's whatever the pot is. There's two types of pensions, really. So you have the money purchase type scheme, which is you pay your money in, whether it's your employer, you pay into your pension pot. That increases. You then draw on that when you choose to draw down or on your pension, and it may not be exhausted by the time you die. So that passes to the beneficiary. So it's that amount.
And that will become subject to inheritance tax.
That will become subject to inheritance tax. Defined benefit schemes, which is your final salary type pensions, they won't escape either. And that's one of the reasons there's a lot of consultation, because it's valuing the worth of those pensions, if they have a value at the time of death, because some do, because they passed, the pension rights pass on to beneficiaries. So it's a lot to discuss, a lot for the insurance companies to get on with. And there will also be some significant changes about how that tax is going to be collected.
Okay.
It won't be as simple as the executive as an estate reporting it on the inheritance tax forms.
Okay.
The insurance companies, pension companies will be involved in calculating and collecting that tax.
Okay. It sounds quite complex, but other than not dying, is there anything anybody can do to avoid this potential tax charge?
It's not really, but probably you will look to reduce your estate as much, even more so than you do now.
Right.
Because now what the bringing in of the pensions means that your estate suddenly increases in value. So whereas before you could exclude that, now you're going to have to bring that value into account. So you'll want to reduce other value, and that might mean drawing on your pension pot and then giving it away. But giving the money away before you die, and ideally 7 years prior to that, is the mitigation. So no big change in that.
So it sounds like the devil's in the detail, and watch this space.
Absolutely. Lots of detail to come.
Okay, thank you. So Tony, inheritance tax is another bit of a contentious tax, and in fact the previous administration had been rumoured to be considering scrapping it altogether. What did Rachel Reeves announce yesterday, and how are we all going to be affected in terms of inheritance tax?
Well, unsurprisingly, it wasn't scrapped. And in fact the opposite. The nil rate bands, which is the amount of estate that you can have before inheritance tax kicks in, that had been frozen until April 2028 by the previous government. It's now going to be frozen for another 2 years, so until April 2030. So you can, depending on whether the nil rate bands you're entitled to, the basic nil rate band is 325,000 per individual, that's frozen. And there is the residence nil rate band where you pass the value of a property on or your home onto the next generation or direct descendant. That's 175,000. That's going to be frozen until 2030.
So the point is, as the values of people's estates grow between 2030, more and more people are going to be dragged into the IHT net.
Yeah, absolutely. So apart from that, the significant changes and slightly worrying changes are to business property relief and agricultural property relief. The names are self-explanatory. And there's going to be a cap on the amount at which that applies at 100%. What that means is currently, if you've got business property in your estate or agricultural property, none of it is liable to inheritance tax.
Okay.
That is going to be capped at £1 million.
Right.
Thereafter, the rate of relief will be reduced to 50%. So instead of being 100% exempt, it'll be 50% exempt. These changes take effect not immediately. In fact, they won't apply until April 2026. Again, there's a lot of fine detail to be put in place on that. Yeah.
Okay, so again, sounds like really not much mitigation you can put in place.
No, partly because we've got no detail,
right.
And even then, no.
Okay. So Tony, stamp duty land tax seems to be a popular way for governments to raise additional revenue from property owners. Any big announcements yesterday?
Not big announcements, but significant announcements for second home owners. So those that purchase a second home, whether it's a home to let
right.
or a home to live in, will currently have to pay an additional stamp duty land tax charge of 3%. That is increasing to 5%. With immediate effect.
Okay.
There's a similar corresponding increase to the higher rates of stamp duty land tax depending on the price of the property. So the additional tax doesn't just start at, well, now 5%. There are further rates depending on the value of the property. So for example, there's a 13% rate for very valuable properties that will become 15%. In addition to that, there is a rather sneaky change that was brought in, which is the point at which that additional rate of tax applies. Mm-hmm. Currently, or prior to the budget, it was 250,000. So you could buy a second home, and if it was less than 250,000, that 3% or now 5% rate wouldn't apply. From next year, not with immediate effect, that rate will be reduced to, the point at which the additional rate kicks in will be 125,000, so it's been halved.
Okay.
So it probably takes most second home buyers
Yeah.
completely beyond that. So unless you're buying a very cheap property for doing up, or it's a very tiny apartment, then the additional rate is going to be likely to be effective, affecting you at the increased rate.
So that one seems to have snuck in under the radar somewhat.
Yeah, I don't think it was seen as a big change, but it actually is really because you know, depending on which part of the country you're in, you could have a holiday apartment for 200,000, 220,000, and it would have escaped the additional charge. That's next year. That's gone. That's gone.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Tony, we've talked about all the notable changes that the mainstream media has picked up on, but were there any other things that caught your eye that we ought to be sharing with our viewers?
Yeah, there were several points. I have a list of them here, but some of the important ones, I think, which will bring relief for some people and pain for others. But on the relief side, we have no change to or withdrawal of the ISA limits, so you can still have the savings accounts free of tax, the ISAs. The only downside to that is the limits have been frozen for another couple of years. So, but you will still be able to open ISAs and get tax-free interest on those. In addition to that, looking down my list, there was a rather sneaky non-change in terms of the high income child benefit charge. Now that's been a charge with a bone of contention for ever since it was introduced. Now the previous government announced there would be changes to the system to make it fairer, and in the interim, while they consulted on that, they increased the points at which the charge kicked in to soften the blow on people. Hidden in the small print in the budget was the withdrawal of those changes. So we're now stuck with a slightly better but still inequitable HICBC charge. It's that's a real blow for many people. Apart from that, really there's not an awful lot. There's a lot of detail. There's the change to tax for non-domiciles, which has been a sort of flagship change for a cause célèbre really for all governments really to try and tighten up on these, and the previous government put in place there's a long consultation, still working on it to some degree, but that will be applicable from next April. So the rules are quite complex for that, and so certainly can't really cover them in detail now, but that will come into effect next year, and really there's not much else to add.
Nothing in corporation tax terms?
No, nothing in corporation tax. I mean, that was one of those things where you create a rumour to say, well, it might increase, and then you pull a rabbit out of the hat and say, there's no increase. So I don't really think anyone expected it. It was just a bit of scaremongering. Yeah. I mean, I think the only other thing I would add, that employers really have got the rough end of the stick here, because coming in next year, while not directly related to tax, it's certainly related to their costs, is you have changes to the national living wage and national minimum wage, and these are sort of, some of them are record increases. Yeah. And on top of that, there's going to be changes to some statutory pay, particularly the SSP, statutory sick pay, in that there'll be no waiting days, so employers will have to meet the cost of statutory sick pay from day one. Yeah. So a lot of costs on employers really, and they will feel pretty hard done by out of this budget, I think.
Okay, well look, Tony, thank you very much for coming in and sharing your insight with us, and hope you all found it very helpful.